welcome everybody. Looks like people are still trickling in. So this is Soil School. I'll just pull this up for a little bit while we're waiting for a little bit longer. I'll do a quick introduction, and then I'll introduce Lakeitha. So I think we're up to 23 participants on this beautiful sunny day. So excited that everyone's here to talk about soil and economics today. Give just maybe one more minute, and then I'll run into my introduction. Okay, the number seems to have fairly stabilized, so we might as well launch in so I don't get in the way of Lakeitha any longer. So, so we're here for the economics of soil health, the cost and benefit of cover crops, conservation covers, and soil health. So some of you may have joined us for other presentations. I believe this is the 5th presentation we've had for Soil School. There are additional ones coming up Thursdays and Tuesdays and Thursdays in the coming weeks, all the way up till April 29th. So if you haven't already checked out the full slate of talks, you should definitely do that. So, but hello, everyone. I'm Scott Gall from West Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District. I'm honored to welcome you tonight on this beautiful sunny day. In case you're not familiar with our organizations, so this is a co-hosted event where West Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District, as well as our partner, Tualatin Soil and Water Conservation District. And Annie was, who's from Tualatin, was kind enough to step in when my audio sounded like a robot. Happy that this is a great partnership. So if you're not familiar with organizations, West Multnomah's mission is to provide resources, information, and expertise to inspire people to actively improve water and air quality, fish and wildlife habitat, and soil health. We serve residents of Western Multnomah County, Sauvie Island, and a portion of the Bonnie Slope neighborhood, which is in Washington County, actually, with conservation planning, weed management, native plants, wildlife restoration, and school gardens. Tualatin Soil Water Conservation District's mission is to create a sustainable, productive, and healthy environment for Washington County, Oregon community. We serve residents of the county by providing educational opportunities, advice, and natural resource conservation and financial assistance for conservation projects. Now, I have a few housekeeping tips for you. You may have noticed that the chat is not. So we're not going to be monitoring the chat very much, but the Q&A section. So I will be monitoring the Q&A section, and if you have a question, please throw it in there, and we will be, like I said, we'll be monitoring that, and then at the end we'll save some time for Lakeitha to answer as many questions as we can get to. If you see a question you like, you'll notice that there's a little upvote there, and by clicking a thumbs up, it kind of puts it to the top of the list. So the more up likes that it gets, the higher that it'll be, and the better chance we'll ask that question. So you should note that that we are recording this session currently. It started when Annie got on earlier, and it will be available on Tualatin's YouTube channel a week after this session. So you can look for it. You can look for links on the web page, or you can go to YouTube and search Tualatin SWCD. Let me, I don't want to get into Lakeitha's way anymore, so I'm pleased to introduce Lakeitha Ruffin, who is an agricultural economist with the Oregon Natural Resources Conservation Service. In 2010, she began her career with NRCS in Bozeman, Montana, and moved to Oregon in 2016. Lakeitha received her Master's of Science degree in Agricultural Economics from the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville. So now I'm going to turn it over to Lakeitha.
Thank you so much, Scott. I believe I am There we go. Do you all see my screen, Scott? Okay, perfect. So this module is on soil health economics. And first, I want to say thank you all so much for inviting me to talk about this. Soil health is a big topic, and a lot of people really want to know about the economic piece with it. And I just want to say, I do notice that when I talk for longer periods of time, my Southern accent tends to come out a little bit more. So you may hear a Southern drawl, and I will definitely be using a lot of y'alls in the presentation more than likely. But bear with my accent as it tends to come out. Today, what I'm hoping to accomplish is to talk about economic principles as well as soil health conservation practice economics. And it's with the intent that you all are able to understand how to apply economic principles in conservation, not just for soil health, but widely on your land, as well as just learning what the economic themes with soil health practices are. Now, you all have been in soil school, and this is one definition of soil health: the continued capacity of soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. Now, this definition really speaks to the importance of managing soil so that it's sustainable for future generations. And to do this, we must remember that soil contains living organisms that, when provided the basic necessities of life, and we're talking about food, shelter, and water, that your soil can perform functions required to produce food and fiber. And I think that's just a really beautiful definition of it. And just thinking about how we take care of ourselves and provide ourselves with the needed necessities so that we can function properly. And it's the same intent that we do that with the soil so we can have healthy soil. Now, economics is the optimal allocation of scarce resources among competing resources. Now, if you realize, this definition does not say anything about money, even though most of the time when people hear economics, the first thing they think of is dollar signs. But really in economics, you're really just trying to figure out what's the best thing you can do, what's the biggest bang you can get for your buck related to the cost associated with it. Now, when you talk about scarce resources, we're talking about land, we're talking about water, time, money. All of those are scarce resources, and you can probably think of others. And what's competing with those resources could be residential housing, if you're talking about land. Water, the competing resource could be water going in streams for aquatic organisms. When I think about my time, competing resources, vacation, because I'm always looking to go on a vacation. Not right now because PDX is pretty cool right now. But you have these scarce resources and you have all these things that's competing with how you need to use it. And economics really helps shape what's the best way to use that scarce resource. So why do we do economics? We do it because we want to know what the economic effects are. And a lot of times that comes down to cost and benefits. It's a great way to evaluate what your options are when you're weighing two different decisions. And it helps with your decision making. Really, by doing economics, you're just bringing more information into the puzzle so you can make a better informed decision. And with economic evaluations, we're looking at land, what's happening with the land, what's happening with capital, what is happening with labor and management, as well as risk and your profitability. So when you're thinking about having some form of conservation practice on your land, how will that affect these different resources? It could be something that's a benefit, or it could be a cost, but it should be documented or at least acknowledged. Going to economic analysis, and I promise it won't be the same economic analysis you all have had in high school or college, at least not to that depth. So in economic analysis, one form of analysis we do is benefit cost analysis. In benefit cost analysis, there are 4 steps that we take on. We identify and estimate costs. We identify and estimate benefits. We convert to like terms, and then we compare. Costs. Costs are anything that goes into the conservation practice to really have it work properly. Some examples of costs could be the installation costs. It could be that you need a new drill for whichever practice you're doing, or if you're talking about cover crops, that's a cost that you have because you need to purchase the seed. Other examples of costs is operation and maintenance, making sure that what you're implementing stays in good condition over the years. Costs could also be an increase in production, increase in labor. Maybe it takes more time for you to go out there. Maybe there's more management. And management could even look at, look in the form of acquisition of knowledge, learning how you need to manage the field. And then you might need some permits, land use permits. So that's an additional cost. Some other costs could also be taking land out of production. Some conservation practices we have, that might be the case. And so that is a cost that you will have to account for. And the benefit side. In benefits, it can be non-monetary as well as monetary. When we talk about non-monetary benefits, that could be saying, oh, we're going to get 10 more ducks out in a park because of a wildlife conservation practice that was implemented. Or it could be that we're saving 3 tons of soil from eroding from the land. Some examples of benefits also include increasing the crop yield. Maybe you're bringing land into production. Other things of benefits that you can capture are decreases. Maybe you don't have to take as many passes along the field. Maybe you don't need as much fertilizer or ag chemicals that you once needed because of a conservation practice. Maybe you were able to reduce the amount of labor needed. Or it could also be, maybe you got rid of some machinery, or you had a reduction in irrigation costs. All of those things serve as a benefit. Now, once you estimate your cost and your benefits, then you convert to like terms. And the reason why we do this is because we want to make sure we have apples to apples. You want to make sure you have things either acre per year or per acre. You can't compare something that's a one-time cost with an annual cost. So you just want to make sure they're in like terms. So in this example, we have someone that was improving the crop yield. They planted a cover crop, and so they improved crop yield. They had soil moisture retention, and they had benefits of $35 an acre a year. But in order to do that, they had to have some costs associated with that, which was the seed purchase for the cover crop, and they needed additional labor. and that came to a cost of $20 an acre a year. Now, to get the net benefit, you will subtract the cost from the benefits, and we came up with $15 an acre a year. Now, when your benefits are greater than your costs, that signifies that the project that you're trying to do makes sense economically. Now, there are times when people may not just focus on whether the benefits outweigh the costs. Maybe someone is just really a steward of the land, and it doesn't matter that monetarily the benefits do not outweigh the costs. And I take the example of wildlife practices where you're wanting to make sure that there's ducks out there, or there's geese, or there's good habitat for owls or something. And so you may not be able to monetize what those benefits are, but you know that you're doing something good for wildlife, and that's enough for you. So even though we have this metric to say benefits greater than costs, you should do it, it really depends on the person, on how they want to move forward. And sometimes they'll move forward even if the costs exceed the benefits. Now, another form of economic analysis that we perform is partial budgeting. In partial budgeting, you display the benefits and the costs, but you only consider the things that change. So when you're implementing a new conservation practice or anything new on your farm, you're not looking at the entire enterprise, but you're only focusing on the things that change. Partial budgeting is also a simple way to collect data. And we use Tcharts to do that in NRCS. And this is what a Tchart looks like. You can't really see the T that well in here, but it's just really having that division between the benefits and the costs. Within NRCS, we always want to have a definition of what we're doing, what the resource concerns are, what the current condition is, as well as the location of where we're working and the dates. And you just begin to list all your benefits and all your costs. And there will be times that you aren't able to monetize what the benefits are or monetize what the costs are, but it's good to have that written down so you know what's happening. Now I'm going to go over some examples of some Tcharts that were developed that are specific to some of the soil health practices. And I'm hoping that it's large enough for you all to see. But this is one that's on cover crops. Now these Tcharts, they were developed based on a conservation practice effects table that NRCS has been using for a few decades. And the agricultural economist out of the West Tech Center, he was the one that looked at the conservation practice effects and lists all the effects, both positive and negative, for every conservation practice we have with NRCS. Now, this list here is really based on the national version. So it will have to be modified based on the specified location of where someone is working. So looking at cover crops, we see that some of the positive effects are reduced erosion from wind and water, maintaining or increasing soil health and organic matter content, improving soil moisture use efficiency, and minimize soil compaction. You see an increase in soil biological activity. You have a suppression of weed pressure, and you can break the pest cycle. Increase food and cover for wildlife. Increase yields, reduce costs as land becomes more productive. And I'm just skipping around with some of the positive effects. Negative effects, you have that planting cost. You need the materials, you need the seed, If you have to buy a new drill for the cover crop, that could be an additional cost. Any herbicide or ground applications that's needed. And with cover crops, you have to terminate. And so that's an additional cost that you would have. You have an increase in management because now you have to manage the crop production, increase in labor for cover crop termination. So those are some of the costs and benefits for cover crops. And I have a few more on here that we're going to go through. This is conservation crop rotation. And as you can see, some of the things are pretty much the same: reduced sheet, reel, wind, and gully erosion. You have increase in crop yield with improved soil quality, fertility, and moisture holding capacity. Increased time managing crop production. And I'll just give a few seconds for you to read through that. Here's another one: residue and tillage management, no-till. So if you're talking about no-till, more than likely you have to buy new machinery for that. You have an increased infiltration by doing no-till. You should have fewer field operations, and so that helps with the air, and it also helps with fuel. Low disturbance and high residue increase organic matter, which buffers salts. Crop residue provides food, cover, shelter, and habitat for wildlife. And I'll just give you all a few seconds to read through that. Now, reading through some of that, you would see that some of the soil health practices that we had, they have common things. There's going to be cost for seed for planting, new machinery. There's going to be increased management, increased labor. And depending on where you are, there could be an increased risk. And if it's something new, there's always that possibility. Benefits: decreased chemical costs, increased productivity, reduced erosion, increased soil quality, improved soil moisture, and reduced soil compaction. But as stated, a lot of the benefits were done on a national level, and it really depends on where you are in the world and what kind of soil you have. But these are some things you could potentially see. Now I wanted to go over some real life examples. There were some conservation innovation grants that were funded by NRCS and awarded in 2018 by the American Farmland Trust. And they started to release a series of soil health economic case studies. USDA and NRCS have invested in the people and tools that provide the quantitative assessments. American Farmland Trust utilized this infrastructure to show the economic benefits across a broad sampling of farming operations and worked closely with NRCS economists and soil health specialists to review the case studies. There were, I believe, 9 different case studies they had on their site. However, I only chose 2. There was one in California and one in Illinois that I chose. But primarily, a lot of the soil health case studies that are done are really situated in the Midwest. And there aren't a lot that's happening out west, nor are there any, well, I haven't seen any to date of small scale farm. These tend to be a little bit larger scale farms. Now, I was looking through the census data, the 2017 Census of Agriculture data, and they have a section on there that talks about conservation. And I thought it was really cool to include this graph, these tables, these maps, in here. And it shows the percentage of cropland by acres in either reduced till or in no-till, and those are some soil health principles and concepts. And as you can see, a lot of it is in the Midwest. We're looking at Iowa and Illinois. You see a little bit in Arkansas, Louisiana, and the Delta area. But if you look out west, you really don't see that high of percentages with reduced till or even no-till. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And so a lot of the studies that's done with soil health are really concentrated in these areas in the Midwest where you see these darker colors. And here's one they had on cover crops. I just think it's really cool that the Census of Ag actually captures all of this information. But looking at cover crops, you can see in the West, at least in Oregon, there's not a lot happening here. Most of Oregon is less than 5%, but you can look up here, I would say like where Multnomah County is and a little bit of the surrounding, you have 5 to 9, but it's not that much compared to the east side of the country. Not so much in the Midwest, but it's really interesting to see which states are looking at cover crops. So here's the first live example, real life example. This is one Rogers Farm out of California. Their farm size is 175 acres and they have almonds on their place. They irrigate their land. They convert it from flood to a double line drip on all but 22 acres of the almond orchard. And in 2009, Tom, that's the person whose farm this is, he began applying compost, mulching the orchard, prunings, and implemented nutrient management to improve tree and soil health. And in 2018, he started maintaining the weed and native plant vegetation for conservation cover. So some of the soil health practices that Tom has on his almond field is nutrient management, conservation cover, mulching, and compost application. What I thought was really cool in reading about Tom's story is that he spends about 22 hours each year at workshops and conferences to further his knowledge. And so there's always something new that you can learn about this. And I think it's cool that Tom was able to capture how much time he spent in just learning about soil health and what he can do on his land. As a result, Tom reports improved soil tilth, water infiltration, water holding capacity, and more beneficial insects, leading to decreased costs for pesticides, fertilizer, and irrigation. And so on this next one, we can look at his economic situation. So we'll start on the increase in net income. So because of the soil health principles and practices that Tom implemented, he was able to increase his almond yield by 10%. He also saw a reduction in his costs for fertilizer. I believe he got rid of using potash completely. And he also had fertilizer savings because of the compost. So he had started using 50 pounds less of nitrogen. He also had pesticide savings due to the compost, so he stopped the fungicide. And he also had pesticide savings because of the conservation cover. And so he was using 56% less herbicide. And he also reduced the amount of irrigation water by 25%. And so just on an acre basis, what he saw was a net income of $1,170 an acre a year. That was a benefit based on what the soil health principles that he used on his field. Now, as far as cost goes, he did have some additional costs. And the leaf sampling, that happens with his nutrient management, because he would do a regular soil and leaf tissue sampling, and he assessed the soil and tree nutrients, and he considers the appropriate amount of fertilizer that is needed for him to use. So that's an additional cost once he started this management system. He also had an increased mulching cost. In using the compost, he had to apply it. And so that was a cost. And he also, we also included the cost for him learning and continuing to learn about soil health and what he needs to do on his land. And all of that came up to be a decrease of $179 an acre. And the annual change in the net income is $991. Now, this whole concept that we just went through with Tom's farm is based on partial budgeting. This is only looking at what changes. It does not look at the entire farm, and it's looking at what that additional cost is or what that additional benefit was. So he wasn't doing leaf sampling before he started the soil health principles. So we only count what started when he started soil health practices. And that's when the leaf sampling started, or that's when he started learning more about soil health, and that was included. Now, as we talk about effects, economic effects on people's land that occurred for them, one of the things I like to caution people is that it's different for everyone. Just because someone with an almond orchard has savings of $991 doesn't necessarily mean the person next door with an almond orchard that went to do soil health principles will have the same effects. There's a lot of variables at play. And so that's just one word of caution that I like to give people. But it's always interesting and cool to see what is happening out there. The next farm that I wanted to talk about is the IFT farm. They're out of Illinois, and they have corn and soybean. And the study size that they're looking at is 1,650 acres. They use cover crops and they use nutrient management on their farm. Now the cover crop that Jim, that's the person's name, they were using cereal rye, and they started to plant cereal rye after corn harvest. And at first they started on 80 acres in 2014, but now they do 825 acres of cereal rye. And Jim, he really credits the cover crop for why they went no-till with their corn. They weren't originally no-till, but they were using cover crops on the soybeans. And this is a quote from Jim. He said, "We wouldn't have attempted no-till corn if not for the improved soil structure we've noticed from our use of cover crops. Cover crops are the key to reducing our inputs." And so the ifs, they have reduced their herbicide inputs because of ample weed control provided by the cereal rye, which I thought was pretty cool as well. And I thought this was another one to bring out, is that he noted that his first attempts at covers in 2014 weren't very successful, but he continued to seek advice from producers using covers successfully and kept at it. And the reason why I really wanted to point that out is that sometimes people, we go into things and we're expecting to see this immediate change, or we're expecting it to work out perfectly the first time, and that's not always the case. And sometimes you just have to kind of work through it and learn more about it and figure out what really works for you so that you can have it implemented successfully. Now, the study area that was chosen for Jim's farm, they only focused on the area that had the covers the longest, and they only focused on the soybeans because when the study started, I believe he was just a year in to having the cover crops on the corn. So they're only focusing on the soybean. So we'll look at Jim's economic effects. So looking at the increase in net income, so they had an increased soybean yield because of the cover crops. So he got an additional 5 bushels an acre. There was also a decrease in the fertilizer savings because of the nutrient management. So he needed less, 20% less of P and K. And he also had a decrease in the herbicides use because of weed control from cover crops. So he saw an increased net income of $39 per acre per year. Now, the decreases in that came with the cover crops that he needed. So the cover crop seed, that was an additional cost. The learning cost that he had because he continued to learn about cover crops, and he continues to learn about cover crops. And so he spends about 160 hours a year learning about cover crops and soil health and what he can do to continue to be a success on his farm. And also the variable rate technology upcharge. So that was new once he started his adaptive approach. And I wanted to read this part. So they have adaptive management, and they took it to their nutrient management as well. And so they switched to a variable rate technology application of phosphorus and potassium in 2010. And so with that adaptive approach, that was something new that they use, part of the soil health principles that they have been doing. So that's an additional cost that they have on their land. And so the total decrease in the net income was $18 per acre per year. And so they saw a change in their net income of $22 per acre per year. So both of these producers, they both saw an increase. You know, they came out in a positive, which is pretty cool. But as mentioned, give it time. Maybe the first year, the second year, it might not be like that, but over time, you should see some changes in the situation. Now, there are different resources available, different places you can go to figure out more about soil health. SWCD is a great one, NRCS is a great one, but also going on field tours. There's different people that are out there, and they are open and they're cool with people coming out to their land and learning more about what they're doing with soil health. And so listening to people's testimonies of what worked for them, that's always a good tool to use, I believe. Scientific literature, that's another one that's good. There's a lot more information coming out about soil health and what works and what doesn't work. But with everything, it takes time and research. And so you might not see exactly what you're looking for or what's really pertinent to what you're doing right now, but in time, hopefully something will be there, but you can still learn from other people. And maybe if you're ready to just jump in and do it, you could be one of the people that can give a field tour and you can give your testimony to someone else. Case studies, just like the ones that we went over, the two that we went over, there's more case studies available. I received an email yesterday about new case studies that were released. So, but they're of course in the Midwest area and in the South. So there's more case studies out there that you all can find. I will say again, if you didn't capture the name of the company, of the company that we had at first that did the soil health studies in 2018, is the American Farmland Trust, or AFT. So you can Google them and find their case studies. I believe they had about 8 or 9, and also the Soil Health Institute. They released some soil health economic case studies recently that was published on their site. And you can always go to the Extension Service as well for information related to soil health and different studies that they have out there. So there's resources for sure, and there are, you can always go to SWCD as well as NRCS for more information related to soil health principles. Thank you. I really appreciate all of you for coming. And if I don't get around to your questions today, my email is there. So you can always send me an email, or you can get in contact with Scott and he can get in contact with me and we'll get your questions answered.
Yes, if you live, farm, work in Multnomah County, feel free to get in touch with myself. I'll put my email in the chat box, and also Tualatin is a great resource for those who live in Washington County. So thank you, Lakeitha. That was great. We do have some questions. If you're ready, I can just read them to you and you can respond as you want. The first question here is actually somewhat related to some of the other ones, but it really gets at those benefits that are hard to quantify. You know, so the question is actually, it seems like there are some ways to value benefits that are not obviously money. Isn't the lack of this valuation why a lot of conservation efforts are not undertaken?
Yeah, because a lot of times I think people really look to that bottom line. And if you don't have that monetized value there, then it's not really computing for some people. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't undertake it. And even though some things aren't quantified, that doesn't mean that it's always going to be unquantified or unmonetized. Right now, we're talking more about ecosystem services, and there's more research being done on ecosystem services and looking at the ecosystem as a whole. And so as research is done or surveys are done, then I believe you will be able to put value to some of the benefits that aren't quantifiable or monetized. When I was in school in economics, everything was a survey. You pretty much gave a survey for everything to see how people value things. But the one thing with surveys is that it takes a lot of time and it costs a lot. And so people just haven't really devoted the time to that. There was a site, I believe it was with USGS. They were actually able to quantify some like wildlife, fish, grizzly bear, hiking, parks, and a lot of that they were able to do because they did surveys. And as time goes on, people just kind of got away from it. I wish there was more information like that out there, but until the research is done, it's kind of hard for people to quantify, but it is being done and more people are looking into it.
And I don't want to steal Lakeitha's thunder, but we do also have incentive programs and things like that help encourage people to try some of this. One for our district is our cover crop program for farmers that are interested in soil health, not sure exactly how it's going to work. We have it's a kind of a limited duration to get a couple of years to test it out and take some of that risk and unknown away from that. So let's see. So I had a couple questions from the same person, and I'm going to try to synthesize it. And Kathy, who asked it, can certainly correct me if I'm synthesizing this incorrectly. But so in your example with the almond farmer, you had some cost benefits. Some of the benefits included reduced irrigation costs, but they pointed out they switched from flood to drip irrigation. And I guess was that, first question is, was that amortized? And then, was some of that benefit not necessarily from the cover cropping, but from switching from irrigation systems? So hopefully I got that right.
Yes, of course it was amortized because that's how we get to compare those apples to apples. And I have to say, kudos, Kathy, for saying amortized, because I'm like, yay! That is like awesome. So yes, it was to get it down to the annual cost. So we're comparing apples to apples in that instance. Actually, with the irrigation part, there wasn't a lot of information related to it. It mentioned in here that he converted from the flood to a double line, allowing him to apply water and fertilizer more efficiently. But I will say, you can find this report if you were to Google the AFT, the American Farmland Trust. This is one of the soil health case studies that they did on there. And it's really, I don't know if you all can see me or anything, but it's really just a quick fact sheet. It's a 2-pager essentially, and it gives you a little bit of information about their farm, what they did, and then it ends with the tables that I showed you all. And there's about 8 or 9 of them on there. And so you can just see what other people have done. There were 2 in California. I can't remember if both of them were almond farmers, but majority of the other case farms that they had, they were corn and soybean, as it's in the Midwest, and that's what they have a lot of.
Here's another question for you. Does this analysis consider greenhouse gas footprint or carbon sequestration, and of offsite benefits of reduced fertilizer or pesticide use? And if you have any examples that include those, yeah. They were asking if you have examples of those.
They did not have anything about greenhouse gas or carbon, I don't recall, but that's not to say that some of the other ones don't have anything on those. And I do know that now a lot of people are really focusing on the greenhouse gas and carbon sequestration and things of that sort. And so I would anticipate as time goes on, we will start to see more information on the benefits of that, as that has become a hot topic within NRCS. And of offsite benefits of reduced fertilizer and pesticide use. We haven't seen, well, that wasn't discussed in the soil health studies that they had on here. It's really just talking about more so at the producer level. And when I have done case studies or when I have talked to different people, I really just focus on that individual land and haven't really gone out to the beneficial, the big public use of it. But I'm sure that if you were to go out there, you would see a reduction maybe to some water bodies, potentially, because if you're using less fertilizer and less pesticide, and here it rains a lot, depending on what your slope is and what kind of ground you have, you could have some runoff from some of the fertilizer and pesticides. So I'm sure if you were to look on the bigger scale, you would see a reduction in that. But typically they just focus on the individual farms.
Well, and to add to that, in an introductory session, James Cassidy talked about increases in organic matter from soil health and soil building, and those can also capture both nutrients and pesticides from running off the site. I'm sure economically that can be very hard to quantify, but let's see, where are we here? So someone in the chat shared a resource there from Direct Seed. Folks specifically focus on large scale grain and small grain production with no-till methods. Let's see, we have a question. I'm surprised there are so few studies of this being done in Oregon. Do you think that is because people believe it won't be worth it, or are there any other ideas why it's not? You should have great math. A lot of it happened in the Midwest, but not so much out here.
Yeah, you know, there's not a lot of people doing it out here. And, you know, I'm going to see if I can, there we go. I'll just use the cover crop one. You know, I was actually really surprised to see this as well, to see how low the numbers were out here. I thought they would be a bit larger. And in talking to some people, I think it's just depending on their risk level that affects what they're willing to do, and also the interaction with other programs they may be part of and what those rules and stipulations are. I think there's other things that come into play when it comes to some of the soil health practices. But there are a few people that are trying different soil health principles and practices. And so I know that there's some people out of, I was going to say Walla Walla, but not Walla Walla, Wallowa County. So the far east, there's some people out there, and there's some people in Pendleton that's doing some cover crops, but there hasn't been a lot of studies going on here. Not that they don't want it to be done economically, but it's just getting to those folks. Now, I did speak to some landowners in those areas, and that's why I always give my word of caution when I look at things that they're doing in the Midwest and they show these huge increases or moderate increases in crops or a reduction in fertilizer and pesticide. And I like to give my little caution of, you know, it's different depending on where you are and what the situation is, because everyone does not get those same benefits. And I learned that when I was speaking to someone in one of those counties, and I came in with this idea based on what I've been reading of these studies that's been happening in the Midwest. And I was like, oh, well, you decrease your fertilizer, right? And their answer to me was no, they use it more efficiently. And that was a brain warp for me, because I was under the impression, of course you decrease fertilizer, and of course you got a crop yield increase. And that wasn't the case for them, but they were really happy with what they were doing soil health wise. And one of the things that they noticed was, as I mentioned, they used their fertilizer more efficiently, but they also noticed more wildlife, which they really appreciated in their field. And, you know, if they wanted to, depending on what their situation is, you know, they can have maybe a recreation, they can make it into like a recreational site or something like that. And that can be an income maker if they wanted to, but it just really varies. But I think some people are nervous, and depending on other programs that they're a part of and what those rules and stipulations are, I think that really comes into play on whether people want to move forward with some of the soil health practices.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people who I've talked to question it say, you know, how am I possibly going to fit this into my rotations? Because you have to plant it potentially when your cash crop's still growing, and then you have to till it in or terminate it in time for you to be able to plant your next crop. I think I don't really see another question here. Folks, we probably have time for maybe more, but I'll just kind of throw out just an observation from your map. Just looking at Oregon, if I squint really hard, the greenest areas look like they're in kind of like Sherman County, which is like wheat, you know, a lot of wheat and dryland crops out there, which again is similar to the Midwest. And the other one looks like Tillamook County, which is, you think of dairies and things like that. I guess it's more of an observation than a question, but it seems like there's certain crops that lend themselves better to cover cropping. And in Oregon, we can kind of grow everything for the most part, except for oranges and things like that. But
yeah, when I think about the people I spoke with about soil health principles, is in the east part of the state, and they're doing wheat or they have cows out there. And even when I was in Montana talking to people in Montana, it was sugar beets for a reduced till operation, or it was wheat. So yeah, it was a whole nother, it wasn't ever the small scale producers, and it wasn't anything other than like wheat for the most part. And then the other stories, corn and soybean.
yeah, maybe those lend themselves better. Though I know plenty of small acreage farmers that do amazing cover cropping. They probably just don't show up in some of these studies. But anyways, Lakeitha, thank you so much. There was some comments in the questions talking about how great this was. So I really appreciate you coming on here. We had over 30 people interested in economics and soil health on a beautiful, bright, sunny day. So that's a huge win for us. So I really appreciate it. And again, folks that are left, this will be available on YouTube on the Tualatin SWCD's YouTube channel here in a week or so. And if you have questions, Lakeitha has shared her email there. So feel free to get in touch with us. So thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of the night.
Thanks, y'all.
Yeah. Bye.